Hello, class. Welcome to week 9. Hey, yeah, you're almost there. This is week 9. Can you believe it? You just have to hold on out for a little bit longer and you are at that finish line and ready to move on to the next set of classes. I'm so proud of you for how hard you've worked and how far you've come this semester. And we've just about refined the writing process. For this week, though, we are studying another new topic, but one that emanates from what we've already been discussing this whole semester. You know, earlier in the first part of the semester, we were studying the system of privileges that are at work in the world and in particular in America. And we analyzed in detail the system of privilege that we have in America that privileges the white race over other races. And then we talked, though, that that's not the only system of privilege at work in America. We have other systems of privilege, almost anything you can think of that somebody would view as an attribute that is different from something you have. That could be a system of privilege, could be based around that. For example, we read in the Beverly Tatum article about the different systems of privilege that she perceives, the major ones in America, and she posited, things like age, system of privilege based around age, depending on the context. It could be privileging youth, or it could be privileging in rarer circumstances, older people. Systems of privilege based around religion. And you see that really in a lot of other countries, especially ones that have state-sponsored or state endorsed religions. Throughout history, systems of privilege have been based around religious systems. For example, in the 1600s in England, the whole reason that the Pilgrims who eventually came here left England was because they were at such a disadvantage there in England because of their religion. It was Puritan, which was different from the Church of England or the Anglican Church, which was the state church in England. So they literally left England. They went to the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, they were also they went to the Netherlands because it was more tolerant. However, they were finding out, okay, maybe they weren't being kept out of certain abilities, like to maybe own property and things like that. They weren't being tortured, which is, that happened to people that weren't part of the state religion. I think as late as at least I know as late as the 1500s, not sure if anything happened in the 1600s, but we do have, in America in the 1600s, the Salem witch trials. So there you go. We have people being killed in America, sponsored by the governing institutions at the time. So you think, wow, we came here, the Pilgrims came here to establish a country, or not necessarily a country, but, an area where they could be free of the restraints they were encountering in England and then later on in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, they were being made fun of. They were mocked. So again, their freedoms were being limited in those ways. So they went back to England and they decided to charter their own ship to come to America, because they knew that there was a whole big continent over there where countries and government institutions had not been set up every which way. So, they settled, maybe they were heading for Virginia, where there had already been existing colonies of the British Empire, but they got blown off course. Be interesting to know if that was an accident or on purpose, because they landed in Massachusetts, of course, as we all know now, Plymouth Rock, where there weren't already established government institutions. People hadn't really settled there. So they were free to basically set up whatever kind of society they wanted. So of course they wanted to set up one that did not have a system of privilege or a set of laws or rules that would prohibit their own freedoms, the puritanical ones. However, then they turned around and they did victimize people who didn't necessarily agree with their own Puritan values and religion, like as in the Salem witch trials. Although it's not as if those people didn't agree with them, but they kind of were being they were being separated out because people perceived them as being different, and then they were killed. And sad chapter in the history of America. Of course, that wasn't the United States at the time, but it was on the American continent, somewhere where we feel as if we've always been enlightened and forward thinking, and maybe not exactly always making the right choices, but making the right choices maybe compared to the rest of the world. Although you could argue that during the 1800s, where we had slavery till 1865, and that wasn't the case in many European countries. So that's something to think about too. So anyway, we were studying those systems of privilege, and the next unit we went on to from there was a study of sex and gender. And as you recall, there are systems of privilege, of course, based around those concepts: sex, gender, and even sexual orientation, where if you're part of the dominant group, you will tend to have the advantages. The group will have the advantages, but individual cases will differ, of course, and that is true of whether you're in the dominant group or in the non-dominant group, or the disenfranchised group. So as you recall from that unit, we examined what the difference between sex and gender is, and we analyzed what sociologists were studying and proposing in the 1950s. And we particularly read about those concepts in the Introduction to Sociology, the chapter 12.1 on sex and gender. And as you recall from that chapter, sex is referring to the biological component of the human, in other words, things like the genetic code, XX chromosomes, XY chromosomes. Of course, XX would determine you as a female, what we call a female, and the XY chromosome combination would determine you as the male sex. And then there are the rare cases where you have XXY, or, those would be some, in between sexual categories. So even when you're dealing with something that is scientific and biological and seemingly objective and concrete, you even then still have ambiguity, because it's nature, and in nature the whole spectrum exists. Anything can happen. Any combinations can come together. It's just certain combinations are more statistically possible than others. Okay, and that's where we categorize from, are the statistical dominant groups and the statistically non-dominant groups, and then you've got the few in between examples where it would be a little more ambiguous to make a call there scientifically. So, and then gender referred, of course, to the psychological component, the traits that we or other cultures and societies tend to associate with the female gender and the male gender. And those tend to then stray a little bit more away from the biology, right? Those are things like in the mind, like do I want to wear dresses? Do I like to wear, and who would associate dresses with females? There's really no reason to do that. It's just a sort of random chance that we have associated dresses in our culture with females, and like pants and more kind of like practical clothing, so to speak, with males. And that, comes from centuries of probably work, employment that required certain clothing for males versus certain clothing for females. And so those are the ways we construct the concept of gender as a society. So now from this basis, this second starting point, we are going to now examine another system of privilege. And it kind of was entailed a little bit when we studied the system of white privilege in America in conjunction with our study of system of privilege. And what that means is we're talking about race this week and next week. We'll finish up weeks 9 and 10. We'll finish up with an essay on what race is and how we define it in America. And how do we define it? What is race? Well, I'm going to bring up a document here. We have, just a minute, handy dandy little whiteboard to examine some of these concepts that feed into and define race in our American culture. And these will sound kind of familiar because we've been reading articles about these throughout the semester. So basically, what is race? We have it right here. How do we define it? Is it based on skin color? Is it based on biology? In other words, kind of like back to the concept of sex, where it's more of a biological determination. It looks at chromosomes and hormonal balances and things like that, like with estrogen and testosterone. And those things then, of course, feed into other things that affect sexual orientation and gender. So is it like that? Is it biological? Can we examine someone's biological code and determine what race they are? Well, we're going to read an article this week called The Myth of Race, and that will tell you, guess what? It's not really biological, right? Race, it's to define it as a biological or a scientific entity is just not correct. It doesn't stand up to science. There's not a set of genetic traits that, is completely definable by race. So then somebody, people might say, well, then let's look to appearance. Is it skin color? Because a lot of times people do categorize race, especially in America, on skin color. However, how many skin colors do we have in the world? We have a lot. You can have Hispanics that are just as pale looking as I am, or you can have them just as dark looking as people that you might categorize as being African American. So it's really not skin color either, right? So how do we define it? Well, I'll tell you, we have most often defined it, especially in America, based on social system. Going back to that system of privilege again, right? It's a social construct. And how have we constructed it? We have a long time in this country constructed it based on social systems that tend to segregate races. And how does that segregation come about? Well, through social systems of like schools, right? That feeds into segregating different populations. Remember in Lucky Zip Codes by Amy Hunter, she talked about, early codes where actually zip codes were redlined, right? Based on, actual covenants and laws that were put into place where you weren't even allowed, if you lived in a certain neighborhood, to sell to a certain race or a certain skin color. And how does one determine that race? If you look at the Jim Crow era, there were laws that were called the one drop laws. And that was if you had any sort of drop of what could be tied back to like the continent of Africa, any kind of blood back there, any sort of drop, you were considered of the black race. And then if you lived in a particular neighborhood, you could not sell to someone of that that had any sort of drop of black blood. And it plays into the concept of even like Barack Obama. He's called our first black president, right? But why is he called the first black president? Is black referring to his race? Is it referring to his skin color? Is it referring to his genetic code? If you examine his parentage, he has one parent that is considered white from America and one that is from Kenya and considered black. So he's really, I guess if you look at his parents, he's half black, half white. So how do you determine which one is the label? Right? Well, obviously with Barack Obama, that label was determined by how he looked, by the color of his skin. So that would have been defining him based on skin color, right? I have a good friend from South Africa, so she is actually my color. However, she's African. And so then you can't really trace back to necessarily where you're even from, right? So it becomes extremely complicated. Other ways people have instantiated these categorizations are through, say, the criminal justice system. So that's another factor. And this week we will be reading pieces that deal with, we'll actually be watching a video that deals with school segregation. That's the John Oliver one. A video that deals with zip codes and how segregation of races is instantiated through redlining codes, which, have been done away with now, but existed, say, in the Jim Crow era. And we're going to be looking at the criminal justice system through the eyes of a black man, Emmanuel Acho, and that's the uncomfortable conversations with a black man, which is of course very timely considering all the protesting and incidents that we've had that involve people of color and law enforcement, and how they can be targets. There are more that end up in the criminal justice system, and so that's another further segregation that plays into like zip codes in schools, because if you're imprisoned, you can't get certain jobs. If you can't get certain jobs, you can't make the money that you would need to buy certain homes that would give you certain schools. So it's all very complicated.